Okay, so we just started here. My name is Nancy Acevedo, and I work with ACT. I'm a sexual assault coordinator. Eva, go ahead.
And I'm Eva Fiallos Diaz, and the Rural Project Coordinator with the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence. Welcome, and thank you for being here today for this pre-summit recording.
Yes, thank you so much. And
go ahead. Do you want to? We want to take just a minute to thank OVW for the Rural Project funding that allows us to bring this presentation to you today. And this type of programming throughout the duration of the 3-year grant cycle with OVW. Today's presentation is called Healing Behind Bars, and really draws on a lot of the knowledge that Nancy has in direct service with incarcerated survivors of sexual assault, past direct service from me, and several input from other members of our project who are here today but not presenting today, and might be a little active on the chat to add information if they'd like to. And so do know that you can provide input on that chat feature, as well as engage in the question and answer if you'd like. And for those of you that are watching this as a recording, if you do have questions, I will share my email, and Nancy will share hers to let you know how you could get a hold of us in the future.
Okay, with the first slide, I actually wanted to read this, and I promise I won't read every single slide, okay? But this is really important. Let me go ahead and read this. When we move into a new home, do we leave the walls empty? No. When we create a PowerPoint, do we only incorporate text? Hopefully not. When we share our travels with others, do we verbalize what we've seen or show it? For me, both. Art is integrated into our human experience. It creates a way for us to express what we have been through, how we feel, and how we view the world. Art can be transformative, revealing, and healing. So the whole point of this workshop is that when we do group counseling at the jails, I can tell you that using counseling art techniques are really important. I have seen that based on my experience that they usually work more than just expressing yourself verbally. And that's what I wanted to actually share with y'all, that our counseling art techniques do really work. Go on, okay. The 2 objectives for this workshop is show the dynamics of doing group and jail settings, as I mentioned, explain the impact of art counseling techniques has on inmates. I call them clients. Yes. At the beginning of group, it's really important for us to discuss confidentiality. But, you know, because it is a group, we cannot guarantee confidentiality. Of course, when it comes to us as facilitators, we will not share anything. However, we cannot guarantee that other participants will not be sharing outside the group. So we do have to let them know that. But when it comes to us, we don't share everything, we don't. And so we do discuss limits of confidentiality. That is really important when it comes to group. And before I see clients for group, I actually assess them. So not everybody is fit to come into group, and that's okay. So before they are allowed to come in, I actually assess them and see if they are fit. Another thing at the beginning of group is that I do want them to actually create guidelines. And when I say I want them to create guidelines, if you think about it, when it comes to jail clients, everything is chosen for them. Everything. When the door is open, when they have food, when they take a shower, when they go out and, you know, for recreation, just for an hour or 30 minutes or so. So just me saying to them, I would like for y'all to do the house rules here for group or the guidelines. It shows that it's their group. So it's more for me, I feel that they are more accountable for what they do. And what I actually do too is I write them down in a big sheet of paper and I tape it to the wall. And that's how I do the ground rules or the guidelines, their expectations. If I see on that white sheet of paper that I want to add something, I say, really quick, I think this is important. Can we just go ahead and add this? So at the end of the day, I make sure that there are guidelines that I would like also in our group. But just that respect for them, I like for them to be incorporated when it comes to the guidelines. So this is really important. It's up to y'all how you want to start. I have seen where facilitators do the guidelines, and that's okay. But just because these are jail clients, I want them to have some kind of choice decisions.
I think it's important because it gets buy-in from your group members, and like Nancy said, like different facilitators are going to have different ways of doing this and the setting that you're in. So this right now we're talking specifically about incarcerated survivors, but when you think about other populations or who the facilitator is too, you might be calling these things differently. You might call them, there are people who call them rules, and I think Nancy mentioned rule sounds kind of rough in what is already a setting that has a lot of rules.
Mm-hmm.
The other term that I like to use is agreements, because it's like, this is what you're agreeing to if you want to be in this group. And because a lot of jail and incarcerated settings, you're getting new members all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so having agreements that you can both not only review, but as a new member joins, hey, is there anything else that we haven't thought of? Or something that would make that individual feel safer, especially because they're coming into a group that's already established and they are new to the dynamic. They're going to change that dynamic. So it's like the buy-in doesn't just happen once, it kind of has to happen continuously in what is going to be an ongoing and open group.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Eva. And then I also wanted to mention the differences in group settings, behind bars and not behind bars. This is really important for everyone to understand because there's so many things, as we discussed, and what Eva also said, a lot of things are controlled when we're talking about behind bars. And let's go with the first bullet point here. It says group supplies controlled. That is definitely a difficult one right there. For example, if you want to come in and bring pencils, you have to count them and you have to make sure that they're not controlled. And at the end of the day, you have to understand that you are responsible for everything that you do bring in. And every jails are different. So it depends really on the jail that you work with. We actually work with 3 different jails, one in Lee County. However, we haven't done a group there. I want to be honest with you. However, one in Hendry County and one in Glades County. And I can tell you they're different, completely different. How, they interact with us, what are the rules there, how strict they are. So I would recommend.
So I noticed that Nancy is currently frozen. I'm not sure which connection is freezing. So I'm going to give it just a second to see if it rectifies, and if it doesn't, I'll jump in.
Let me know, Eva, if you can see me. I see that they can still hear me, Eva.
Yeah, there we go. It's coming back.
I am so sorry.
All right.
I'm not sure if it's my
okay.
Wi-Fi, but this is what happens when you work in a pandemic.
Exactly. This is normal. This is something that may happen throughout our presentation or throughout, and so we're going to extend lots of grace for ourselves in this moment. So what I last heard was we were talking about the pencils and like the idea that like, you know, anything that when you're working with a jail setting, you have to be really respectful of what their guidelines are around what's considered contraband. And sometimes they have, you know, they're going to be different. One jail site might have had a situation where somebody used a pencil as a weapon, and so they've now banned, you know, there tends to be this overreaction. Like if one person did it, like there's like everybody gets punished for that indiscretion, right? But you know, then again, you know, pencils can be a harmful thing if used as a weapon, and so we have to trust that these what's considered contraband is often a way to keep us safe as well as to keep the inmates safe. And so when we're open with the folks that we're working with, and they're communicating this to us, the more willing we are to be flexible, usually the more willing they are to be flexible with us. And so they might say, okay, you can bring the pencils, like Nancy was saying, just you need to account for how many you brought in and then how many come out. And that needs to match up. So
yeah.
I think that's where you were, Nancy.
Thank you, Eva. And then actually the next slide, I'll show you how I do it, just to make sure that everything is clear. But, you know, not behind bars. Let's go to right here to the right. When it comes to group supplies, we don't have to worry about, you know, if they're sharpened or not sharpened. You know, we do have to think about money, unfortunately, still. But, you know, other than that, we don't have to worry about it. The second bullet point here says facilitators can't go over their time. I can tell you that it's definitely very strict. For example, when we used to do our groups, right now we're not doing groups because of the pandemic, but every 2 weeks when we would come in, our group started at 10 a.m. and we were done at 11. I would actually get there around 9:30. I was pushing it if I was getting there at 9:40. Why? You have to keep in mind that they will check you, all of it, you know, yourself, the group supplies that you're bringing in. And when everything is okay, then you go into a room and you have to wait for the clients. So it can take about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes until they're coming, you know, into the room. So just keep that in mind. You only, like whatever you agreed with the jail, of course, you only have that limited time. So for example, for me, I had to leave by 11 a.m. because there were attorneys coming in. So just keep that in mind that they are pretty strict when it comes to, you know, doing your group and being able to get out on time. Not behind bars, you don't really have to worry about it. It's more flexible, it's on you. Of course, you want to be consistent, of course. However, it's not as strict. The third bullet point here says participants have to see other inmates regularly and not behind bars. Participants can choose to interact with others or not after leaving. Keep that in mind. That is really important. I understand that when they're in group, especially at the beginning, we have to keep that in mind that they may not share a lot at the beginning. They're kind of feeling the group. And I'm pretty sure all of us, if we were in a group, we kind of feel the group, and then we start, you know, trusting, and then we say, you know what, this is not bad, I want to share. So it's the same thing when it comes to a jail group. They want to see what's going on first. And just keep in mind that they do have to go back and eat together, go into recreation and everything. So just keep that in mind that if they're not sharing so much at the beginning, it may be the second group that they share a little bit more, but you know, it takes some time. And that's pretty much it for this slide. Okay, this is a checklist that I actually have that I created. As you can see, it's the different materials that sometimes that we use here. And if I have 7 artists canvas, I make sure I have 7 back. And this is what the way that I do it. I like to be clear and with my clients. So I actually count them in front of them. So I say, hey, whatever her name is, I say, hey, Maria, can you help me out? And everybody watch us count these materials. And then what I'm gonna do on this checklist is I'm gonna initial. So that's what we do at the beginning of group. And at the end of the group, I said, Maria, can you help me out? We're gonna count these together, everybody watch. And I initial again I can either make 2 copies, one for coming in and one for coming out, or just, initial twice on this sheet of paper. So it's really important. I did have a situation where I couldn't find an art brush. And inside, I was a little bit freaking out, but I didn't show it, of course. I later found it in that same session of group. I found it in a small pocket of my bag. So somehow we didn't use that brush, and I put it in the bag, and we couldn't find that 10th brush. So we did find it. I did find it, and I was very thankful about finding that brush. Very thankful. If not, then I do have to bring an officer, and they have to check us, and they have to check my bag. So just, I didn't want that to happen, but I am aware that it is a jail setting and it could happen. So that checklist is very important, however you do it.
Yeah. I love, thank you so much for offering up that story for us and for our participants, like the attendees and whoever gets to see this recording in the future. Like, I think that like your real life experience, like, and showing like, here's an example of something that you can create for yourself just to make your life easier. But the story itself, I think that lived experience is so important because it shows not just how much you care, but how creating that process of counting the materials and getting your group participants involved in that process, like it normalized that like you were there for them, that they were also able to be helpful to you. Like again, like that piece about buy-in, right? It's like we established these guidelines together, we're watching out for one another. And like the fact that your first thought was like, I do not want to bring an officer in here because I don't want to get them in trouble. I don't want to do anything to diminish the trust that I've built with these people. They're telling me that they don't have the brush, and then like come to find out like it's in my bag, right? Mm-hmm. Like I think that like all of us would have that moment of internal panic where we'd be like, oh my God, did somebody take the brush? And like, if they took the brush, like not only did they if they took the brush, but now I'm going to be responsible if they do something with the brush, and what are the implications for like future groups? And then like how relieving it must have been to find the brush and then be able to think to yourself, wow, like I can trust my group. And like, it was just a human mistake. And these people appreciate having me here, and I'm so glad that like I don't have to now go back and be like, oh man, I can't trust you all with my brushes, So thank you. That's a really, really beautiful story. And so I think it kind of leads into this next slide where we have to kind of keep in mind what the history of prison systems and jail systems in our country looks like. And so even though the federal prison system was established in 1891, the original first prison in America was founded in 1790 by the Pennsylvania Quakers. And so when they established that first prison, their aim wasn't to punish people. Their aim was actually the opposite. It was to create something that was less cruel and brutal than the previous systems, which were basically dungeons. And so they talk about dungeon prisons and jails of old. And so I think the idea of a dungeon evokes for us a very different idea, right? Like sort of the idea of torture, the idea of like more corporal type punishments. And so historically, what we do around things like that is we move a little bit to the left, right? Like where we say, oh no, we don't want to do things like this anymore. We want to do them in a more kind and humane way. And we move in that direction, but inevitably we also then move back in the other direction. And so there's kind of like a pendulum kind of constantly swinging depending on what the historical context of our time is. And so although we wanted to establish this system that was less brutal and less cruel, and we created this, the intent actually for Quakers, if you know a little bit about the history of Quakers, they're peace loving, and they were really involved in anti-oppression, anti-racism work. A lot of them in the early times, like Civil War, but they wanted prisoners to be able to read scripture and to repent, to think about what were the things that they had done, how could they do things differently, and so give them a space to really start to do some internal work for themselves. Over time, systemic oppression, as we know, and privatization of our prison systems really de-evolved that concept from its rehabilitative aim and roots to something that, again, has become punitive. But what we do is we clean the language around it, right? And so this is where language can be, and the word that I want to use is escaping me, but it can be a way to present an idea or a thing as something that it isn't, right? It's like if I call it this, then it feels like it isn't a dungeon, right? If I call it a prison as opposed to a dungeon, right? But what we know, and the reason that we are in these facilities, is that we know that conditions are rough. Mm-hmm. We know that survivors, particularly on the inside, are not doing the type of healing that they could be doing. They're not getting enough rehabilitative services. And so our aim is to be a rehabilitative service. But the environment itself is not one that necessarily lends itself to that. So when we go in with this, we have to have both things in mind. We have to know that for right now, what we're doing is we're planting seeds mm-hmm. for people. We're planting thoughts, we're planting ways for them to realize and to remember that the world on the inside is very different than the world on the outside, but that eventually they're going to return to that world, and they have to do some internal work to be able to readapt to what's on the outside. And that now that they have this time, that they're just kind of sitting ducks, like, why not use that time for something helpful, something healing? And so, prioritizing healing might not be something that every prisoner wants, or they may be in a place where they just need a little push. And so we'll talk about that a little bit further in as well. So this is just kind of to keep expanding into that theory, right? So what happens when you are in a prison setting? Essentially, you're seen as not really a human anymore, right? And so I'm not going to read from here, but they really struck me, the concept of being stripped down to a number, for me, evokes this idea of like the Nazi concentration camps. It evokes the idea of migrant camps as well. And so when we talk about confinement, we're not just talking about like the type of confinement that happens literally, like to the body, to the person, but also the confinement that happens to the mind in many ways. So being able to provide services behind bars reminds individuals of that world, right? Like the world that they actually belong to, that even though they're in this place right now, this is a very tiny microcosm, that the world is much bigger. And we come in and we're a reminder of what the world on the outside is like. And so where possible, we want to remind them that there's kindness in the world. We want to remind them that there's hope in the world. And so, as I myself, I'm a social worker. I know that not everybody comes from a social work background, but we have mental health counselors, we have marriage and family counselors, and then of course we have partners who may be clergy or lay faith members of our communities. And all of us, like, the one goal that we have where we can really meet is that we're there to instill a sense of hope for folks who are not horrible people. They're not really any different than we are. They have done horrible things, right? And that's part of what we're trying to remind them is, yes, you did a really horrible thing. That doesn't mean that 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 is who you are. It doesn't mean you are a horrible person. And so, however, when you are in that setting, it's normal for you to be guarded for your own protection because you are around other people that you don't know and you don't trust. And you're in a constant state of fear. And so, as we know, fear is what triggers in our brain the amygdala, which is our sense of, it's in our limbic system, which is towards the middle of the brain. And we often will do a model of the brain in this way. So we talk about how, you know, inside you have the amygdala, which is in the brain. And if you can imagine this being the front part of your brain and this being the back, what happens when you're in a state of fear is we call it flipping your lid. You flip your lid, right? And so that frontal lobe, which is the seat of what we talk about being logic. It's our ability to reason. It's our ability to find words to describe what we're feeling and what we're where we are. We can't, right? That's why so many people, we talk about incarcerated survivors, like, or incarcerated people in general, freaking out, right? Like they have freakouts, they have panic attacks. That happens out of a result of like that flight, fight, or freeze reaction. And even more so for an incarcerated person who has experienced trauma, right? And so when we're talking about art therapy as an effective way to help healing, what we're really talking about is a bypass to the issues created by that state of alert. We're talking about like no longer needing to communicate with that frontal lobe because that lobe is offline. So we need to communicate with the emotional being, right? We need to communicate directly to the fear that is causing the reaction, which is now autonomic, right? So it's automatic. It's happening without that person really even thinking about it anymore. Art therapy, particularly for people with trauma, helps us then like reground ourselves. And I'll talk a little bit more like further in about how that happens. And we have to remember, like, it's not just incarcerated survivors that have trauma, right? Like
Right.
most humans have trauma.
So here, thank you, Eva.
Thank you.
Here it goes more further, and it says, you know, research shows that when it comes to counseling art techniques, they can be effective in increasing mood, loss of control, socialization, and problem solving in incarcerated inmates. And I don't like to say inmates. I'm not sure why. I just say my clients, you know. And I can tell you one story about a client that, actually clients that I had at the Glades County Jail. And I can tell you, like I said, it's a jail, so they're strict, okay? And I was able to bring in paint, acrylic paint, brushes, everything that you saw on my materials, a checklist. And I told them, you know, what the project was about. And for like literally 5 minutes, they were around the table. They kept just staring at the material and everything. And it was kind of sad for me that they were looking at me for approval for them to start touching the material. And I said, you can go ahead and grab whatever you like and do, you know, what we said we were going to do here. And they're like, Nancy, so we can paint? Is that what you're saying? And for me, I mean, they're paints, right? You know, I've never been in jail. I want to be honest with you. So for them, they couldn't believe that they were allowed to be able to do this project. They were so thankful. And the art that they were able to create in that session, I mean, it was so beautiful. But for me, I'm also learning from my clients, even though they don't know that. I couldn't believe what they were saying to me. Like, Nancy, all we see is brick colors, like same color every day. And then you're here bringing us, you know, 50 different types of colors. They didn't know how to react to that because I was giving them the opportunity to be able to create something. Even the clients that say, you know, I'm not really good at art, they were really into it. They were like lost and they forgot that they were actually in jail. We treat them as human beings, and that's really important. So I can tell you for that 1 hour, they felt that they were in control. At the beginning, like I said, they couldn't believe it. So they just stay there. And I'm like, you can go ahead and touch the stuff. It's okay. But it's because for me, they're colors. For them, I can actually touch them. So just keep that in mind that they, in this story, they felt that they were in control to be able to do their painting. Yes.
So we know that obviously, and like from that story, that it is effective, right? There's
Mhm.
something effective about art and healing, but why? Why is it effective? And so that's kind of what I was giving you a hint at, right, earlier, is it's effective because it forces people to engage in sensory experiences that interrupt the signals to the brain that have become enacted as a result of that flight, fight, or freeze reaction. And so when we talk about art, we're not just talking about creating a masterpiece, right? Or creating a masterpiece at all. Like, and that is a hang up that a lot of people have about engaging in the process of art. We're talking about the creative process in general,
Right.
right? And what it does to the body, what it does to the mind. But more importantly, we're talking about communicating with people's inner child or inner children in this case. So holistically, what happens is not only are you like looking at the table and seeing how many colors and how many color combinations are possible, right? And so you're engaging your vision. Then you're picking up the materials, and when you pick up a material like a crayon, for example, we call them crayolas. But as you start to draw, you know, it also has a smell to it. You know, I don't know how many people I have engaged in like coloring over the years who are adults who are like, oh my God, I haven't colored in so long. And there's something about the smell of the crayons that takes them back to an earlier time. It takes them back to a time when things were simpler, when things weren't as dark, where there was hope, where they could have become anything they wanted to. And we want them in that state. We want to create a little bit of that vulnerability, but we also want to get them back in their bodies. And so art allows for all of this. It's visual, it's sensory, like kinesthetic, in the sense that you're touching materials and you can feel lots of different textures. It's movement based, you know, because you're having, and you know, you can get a lot of energy out. Like there are, and we'll talk a little bit about that, right? But the exercises that you choose can be really important too for allowing different types of expression, whether it be like anger, I'm angry, I'm like gonna scribble all over this thing, or like getting in your head like, okay, no, I need to like center and ground. And so what does one exercise look like over the other, depending on where your survivors are, and how you need to intervene with them therapeutically and holistically. And so, yeah, so we are talking about taking a person whose traumatic experience has somewhat stunted them. And so often what you'll see with survivors is that, you know, we, especially, I don't know how many people have seen like Orange is the New Black and stuff like that, but there is some truth to some of the personality types and how like they get really excited about little things. We do too, right? Like I do too, I know for sure. And it's because there are places where our trauma happened where we get stuck, right? And so when you talk about like, oh, I can't believe this person gossips like they're still 15 or 16. What happened to that person when they were 15 or 16, right? They don't have to tell us. Like just what comes out in their personality and in their interactions around the art is going to give you a lot of insight into where they are.
On this slide, this is actually a group that I did at the jail. And let me go ahead and, you know, read this real quick. The goal for this group was to paint what you would tell yourself on a bad day. What would you tell yourself when you're having flashbacks or something is triggering you and reminding you of your trauma? This, I can tell you, let me go ahead and read one of them. be kind to yourself, smile. I think that's beautiful, because what happens sometimes when we feel sad, we criticize ourselves. So just having that for that client, reminding them, it's beautiful. And another one here, um, I'm free. I see that one. And then, oh, and I can't really see really well right now. It's okay not to be okay. You got this. It's to the right. And I can tell you, many of my clients, they love to do this. Another thing that they actually tell me, they say, Nancy, you actually brought us canvases so we can paint. I say, yeah, of course. If I would want to paint, I would want some canvas too. So again, treating them like humans. You know, would you want a canvas? I would, so I can feel like a real artist. I can tell you that. So, and of course, we have to think about budget and everything. But I want them to feel that, you know, they are human beings. They are, you know, I would like this for me, and, you know, I want the same for them. So this is just one group that I did, and they loved it. I actually think I did it in 2 sessions because, like I said, it takes some time, and you only have 1 hour to, you know, to do group. And one of the things that I also do with the client, they can't keep their art at the jail, you know, for safety, of course. But what I do is that I let them know about my contact information, and they leave me their address. And when they actually call me, and I had 2 clients only, I want to be honest with you, that have called me and said, you know what, Nancy, can you send me my art? So I have it with me, and I send back their art to them. So they actually contact me, and they want their art. So I think it's a beautiful thing. So I feel that I did impact them.
That's really beautiful, Nancy. I love that you're already like linking them up, like, because there's another really wonderful thing about that, is that they're also able to access services after their release, right? So after they re-enter the community. And I think that that technique really allows survivors to start thinking about coping mechanisms and what would be most effective to them, right? Like, not just on the inside, but like, you know, later down the road. I thought what you said about the canvases was so telling, right? When we're thinking about survivors and what they've had to endure in their lifetime, we know that there is this sort of abuse to prison pipeline, right? That happens, that our jails and our I was going to say cárceles, so our jails and our prisons are disproportionately filled with people of color, right? And then I bet that if you looked also at what the stratification in terms of class, right? Like where we are in class systems, that you're going to disproportionately get people who have grown up with severe disadvantages. And so it's not surprising to me to hear that, you know, that somebody would be shocked that they would be given access to a canvas. And when you think about like how widely available canvases are nowadays, like that most dollar stores are now carrying small canvases. Yeah. That you know, not having access to something that could have made such a big difference in their creative expression, in their emotional expression, like earlier in life, like would have that much of an impact.
And Eva, really quick, I also wanted to mention, I like what you said, where you mentioned that they're able to contact me even after when they're released. That is true. I have had, you know, a couple of clients that, you know, after they're done, you know, with the jail, they're trying to work on their life and stuff. They call me up and say, Nancy, let me just get my stuff, you know, a little bit more stable, and I will come back to you so we can start, so I can start seeing you. So yeah. They do actually call me, and that's beautiful, because I know that I have impacted their lives. So I know, and I always say, if I see 10 survivors or 8 survivors, 6 survivors in a day, I did impact them, but if I had only one come back to me, that's okay. I did help those 10, 6, 8, but one came back. That's okay. I did my job. So I can tell you this is what I use in when it comes to the jails, and I really like it, and it does work because clients after they are released, they do come back to you, and that's my experience in that. So thank you, Eva, for reminding me about that. And this is another group here. We actually did this back in March. We were preparing. This was actually an assignment that we had to do for Eva, for Sam, Sexual Assault Awareness Month for April, and we were getting ready. But this pandemic happened. But it is what it is. And the goal here was for the clients to write a letter to a fellow survivor. So this is what I put. If you could write a letter to someone who has been in your shoes, what would you tell them? I really like the one on the right, the painting here, the drawing here. It says, "Dear survivor, you aren't alone. Everyone goes through things, but it doesn't mean to let your past make who you are. It's not how you start, but how you finish." And then at the bottom it says, "Stay true." And then at the there it says, "Beauty in the struggle." These are beautiful. I have them, and I just really like all my clients' artwork here. I really do. Let me read this one. It says, "Dear survivor, healing is a long process, and that's okay. My goal is to have more good days than bad days. Try to remember to be patient and kind with yourself. Love, survivor." So we were actually going to share this with Spark, these survivor letters. However, we had to put things on pause, but these are beautiful things that my clients have done at the jail. And like I said, it really does help our clients. They actually, of course, I asked them if they would like to share, and they all do. They all share in group. Some at the beginning, like I said, are reluctant. When I tell them, okay, this is our goal, this is what I would like for y'all to do, they do just stare at the paper. They're like, okay, what do I do? And I usually try to do at least one with them. I say, I'm going to do one with y'all. So they know that I am also part of the team, part of the group too. And next thing you know, they are creating. They're creating art and they're expressing. And they do get teary. I have seen that because it's not just creating. Like Eva said, it's the process that they go through when they're creating this art. So I can tell you that it really works. It really does work. And I think, okay, I'm going to actually, yeah, we can go to the next slide. I have another story, Eva. I have so many stories, seriously. This one also was last year. I think it was last year, Eva, for SAM month. This was given to us by the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence, and we did a group at the jail. And let me go ahead and read this here. It says, "Paint and create half of the mask to represent how you feel about yourself, strengths and weaknesses, insight, etc. On the other half, paint how you feel, how you like to feel and be." So if you see the first picture here on the left, they have here angry, scared, trust issues, lonely, sadness, and crying. And let me tell you, when they're doing this, many of the times they're very quiet, but I can see that they're processing a lot. And then on the right side, I see here is, "I want peace." That's what they're looking for, peace. They want to be happy. They want to be loved. They want to be more talkative. They want hope. They want to feel beautiful. And again, here it goes. They want peace again. So kindness and patience. So the last 20 minutes of group, we usually have the clients share. And it's a beautiful moment when you see how that piece of art, and I never assume, say, is that, or what is that? You know, let them explain it. And sometimes what I also seen is color means a lot in their projects that they do. So I don't know, like gray could be sadness. And they explained that to me. Like, I wanted to create that sadness with this paint. So it, you know, don't just assume, let them explain what their art is. Okay. And this helps them bond, relate, and be supportive about their process and healing. It really does. It makes them have like a tighter group because they're able to see the similarities that, you know, you're also struggling as I am. You also want peace, you know, and I'm also looking for that too. So it's beautiful when you start seeing them really bond. You know, I don't even have to say anything. The group really runs on itself. And when you start seeing that, you're like, okay, I'm doing a good job. I'm okay.
So we left off with Nancy kind of going through two slides, the slide about the survivor letter and the mask exercises. And so I jumped in and wanted to say that the letter is amazing in that the letter writing technique in the previous slide allows survivors to think back to what they would have liked to have heard or known at the time that they either disclosed or that their abuse came to light. And while it's meant to be a letter to a fellow survivor, it also makes the writer really get in the head of being someone new to their healing journey. And so it makes them think about themselves and also what they have overcome, right? Like what they had to go through. So in many ways, a letter that the survivor writing is writing to their past self. And so they think that they're writing it for another survivor, and they are, but they're also writing it to themselves in some ways. And so I wanted to hold that up. And then I also wanted to say something similar about sort of the MASS project. The MASS project allows you to kind of look at the duality of what it means to be a survivor and a victim. And what we know about survivors is that survivorhood is messy, right? Like we often talk about survivors like, oh, they survived, right? And we don't think about more like, well, what about those survivors who aren't surviving or thriving, right? What does that look like? And what does that dark part of themselves look like? And also be able to hold that reality that it's okay if you're a hot mess, right? Like we can't all be overachievers. We can't all be in a space where we've overcome. And that, you know, I love this visual of the lotus flower. There's a lotus flower art exercise actually that is quite beautiful. The lotus flower grows out of the muck. You know, it has to plant itself under the water in the mud, and before it can ever reach the surface and become a beautiful flower. And so some of these exercises really are also meant to explore the dark side of survivorhood, what it means and what it looks like, and to normalize that for them as much as for themselves and for other survivors that come afterwards. And so with a lot of this, I was saying that I really want to hold up the experiences of survivors who have undergone these journeys with me, who have been vulnerable, and who have taught me a lot about what survivorhood looks like. Because, you know, ultimately, if we're not learning as much from our survivors as they're learning from us, then there is a part of that isn't reciprocal, and that isn't like who we should be aiming to be in these movements. The other kind of point that I wanted to drive home is that Nancy said something that was so meaningful when she talked about engaging in the exercises with the survivors. Those of us who have gone through schooling and university work, or even just informal like sort of certification processes for doing the kind of healing work that this entails, know that there are these categories, like very fine categories that we're putting: professional, survivor, or professional client, right? And that's not the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation, particularly in rural communities, which are small, is that we are living in community with one another. And we need to shift significantly the way we think about people and the way we think about healing. Like this person matters to me, not just because they're a survivor and something horrible has happened to them. Likely they have done horrible things too. I've done horrible things in my lifetime, right? We all do. Whether small or big, it doesn't matter. And so the idea is to remember, like, who do I want to be in my community? And who do I want them to be in community with me? Because ultimately this person is re-entering the community, and they are going to be a part of that community. And so when we sit down to do an exercise with our survivors, we're showing that we are willing to be just as vulnerable with them as they are with us. It's eliminating that line that says you are them and I am someone else, right? Like it's kind of, there is definitely a need for boundaries, you know, like clear and boundaries between like what your role is, what you can and can't do, and upholding those boundaries, right? Like the idea of for those of us who are in the movement who are also survivors, the idea of how you use your own stories and when you share and when you don't, it becomes really important as well, right? And so one thing is that, like, at the core, you're there to serve the survivor, to center their needs, to center their emotions and their experiences. Anything that you share should be a way to promote that process for them. If you're making it about you, then you've crossed a boundary in that situation, right? But I also want to kind of go back and say that some of the unlearning that we have to do around the ways that we've been taught to do therapy are that it's a very sort of singular process that doesn't take into account cultural differences. And so when we're talking about culturally specific ways of serving survivors, particularly survivors who are incarcerated, some of that needs to look very different. And so one of the jobs of an advocate is also reteaching people how to do this work with Latinx survivors, how to do this work with incarcerated survivors, rural survivors, right? Anyone who's at the margins, who isn't going to be your typical sit on the couch and have a conversation with me survivor. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about that, right? Because when we talk about things like what are we trying to promote with the therapy process beyond just the art, beyond just the healing, there are other modalities that we can incorporate at the same time. Like when I started talking about what art therapy does in terms of re-engaging the sensory experience, really what we're talking about is mindfulness, right? And so mindfulness becomes a large part of something that we're not specifically saying, oh, this is a mindfulness technique, but it is, right? And so we're aware of that behind the scenes. We are using the language that is appropriate to the situation with the population that we're serving at the time. So we might not be throwing those terms out at them, but there is some method to the madness, right, behind that. And so there are a couple things on here too when we talk about some of the things that are common in our movement, such as empowerment-based therapy, therapy that is based in a feminist framework, work that is based on motivational interviewing, which is really important with this particular population. It's centered on the process of change. And so you can, like I said, learn a lot about how a person thinks and the way that they engage, by the way that they engage with the activities. And so since these activities tend to be disarming in a way that being expected to think rationally, right? Like if you were doing just talk therapy aren't, often you will find that people start talking naturally. They offer up information that they never would have had you ask them like a question and they had to like, why are you asking me this, you know? Because they would get defensive, perhaps you would trigger something for them, you know, and you can't know, or they don't want to share in a group setting, you know, it might be something that they would be willing to share with you, but not in this particular setting. And so this is where structuring the art around themes that explore our shadows, our fears, our hopes can be really, really beneficial to moving people through that process of change, which is what motivational interviewing is all about, is where are they in their healing process? You know, it isn't our job to change people, but it is our job to convey that change is possible, that healing is possible. And so when we think about like, okay, this person doesn't even think that they have anything to heal from. They're like really uptight. Their body language is telling me that, you know, they're like this, and they're like just listening. So that tells us that, okay, this person is at the stage where they're listening, but they're not hearing like how trauma has impacted them, because they're that guarded, right? And so the goal for that person is going to differ from the goal from the person who's like, yes, I want to share my poem, you know, like I want to talk about openly about what's happening here, because that person's already engaged and trying trial and error. Like, I have a plan, I am engaged in my plan, and then like I'm going to relapse from time to time and go back to using some of the negative coping skills that I've always used, right? And so those are things to kind of keep in mind. Like, being person-centered means that you understand that everybody is going to be in a different place at a different time in their journey. And the psychoeducational piece is just kind of like, again, like that idea of planting seeds. Like, oh, well, let me like challenge that idea that you have. Like, I'm curious about why you think, where does that come from? Like, tell me a little bit more about that. And then just challenging that, you know. So it might be that they, one of the things that I often hear with women is like this idea of like being women hating, like, oh, I don't trust women, I get along better with men, because all women are gossipy. And I'm like, oh, well, where'd you get that idea? How did that happen? We live in a society that often pits women against one another, right? Where we could be having really healing and uplifting relationships with one another. Maybe we haven't had those experiences with other women. What would it look like to actually have that? How healing would that be, to be able to trust a woman, and particularly if maybe you're a survivor who was abused by your mom or by another female, you know, family member or friend or neighbor. And so those things become extremely important in ways to kind of tap into that healing potential.
And I wanted to talk about the benefits of implementing art counseling techniques. One of them would be a great benefit of using art therapy techniques is that no art experience is needed. We mentioned that, you know, throughout this workshop. We also mentioned many of the times, the last bullet point here says clients who may be reluctant to attempt an art therapy technique project tends to quickly become comfortable and enjoy the process of the activities. And it happens, even though at the beginning they're like, I don't know about this, or whatever actually she put in her body language right now, where, you know, she crossed herself, her hands. That happens a lot in counseling when it comes to the clients. They'll look at you and check you out and see what you're all about first. And next thing you know, they're talking to everyone in the group, but they're feeling everything. And, you know, even with the clients that we mentioned that think that they don't have any talent, they start expressing themselves through art. And I can tell you this really works. The benefits, there is definitely benefits here. Ella, if you can go to the next slide. And more benefits about counseling art techniques are the following here. It allows the client visualization, joyful memory, positive versus negative. The one that I really experienced and I will never forget is the one here. It says my relationship with blank. Here I actually had one client that I had a really hard time. I had seen her in the jail for about 6 months, and we were doing individual counseling. And when she would get teary, when she would start wanting to express herself, and I always keep in mind that I do understand that after our session, they have to go back to their cell. So this is more of a protective matter when it comes to the client. So we have to keep that in mind. And when she would get teary, she would stop the session automatically. I'm fine, Nancy. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'm good. I want to go back to my cell. And in that time, I said, okay, that's okay. And she does go back to the cell. And it's hard for as a counselor because you think, oh man, I just left her like that. You know, what's going to happen? And I remember she started to come to group and we did one of the projects, and it was about, I think it was painting your happy moment with someone, feeling safe. And she actually did a canvas on, it was a picture of the ocean with a boat, and it was very sunny. And she had someone with her in that painting, and she, you know, it was her time to share, and she wanted to share. I was wondering if she was going to share or not, because like I said, she was a tough client. And she just started bawling, like crying and explaining, and she wanted to just let it out. And like I said, in individual counseling, I had a really hard time for her to express herself. And here in group in front of 5 other women, she was really out there explaining her art and was crying. And you can tell we all got a little teary. We're like, okay, I'm over here thinking, be professional, Nancy, be professional here. But it was a beautiful moment. She explained to her, to us, that she had lost her husband about a year ago and that he made her safe. And one of the things that they would do when she would feel stressed out or have panic attacks or triggers, that they would go out on their boat. And she felt safe with him, and it was her safe moment. So for her expressing, it was so much for her to express in group when I have had a hard time for expressing in individual counseling. So I'm telling you, the benefits when it comes to group counseling and using counseling art techniques are amazing. It works. It really does work, especially with tough clients and you think like, I don't know what I'm doing in session and individual, they don't want to really talk about it. You know, we understand. You know, we give them their space, but you can see a difference when they come into group. You can actually see it. So that was, I definitely remember that one there. Yeah. And then,
So yeah, so just how you're able to tap into that sense of like what's coming up for the individual. So support group versus individual can serve different functions. And Nancy was speaking to that when she was speaking about that last client. And so one of the things that I love to explore that Nancy talked about at the very beginning of this presentation is the idea of like, you need to know who's appropriate for group, right? Like what is it that they're hoping to get out of their healing work, and how can that best be accomplished, right? And so some of that is what you learn when you first do an intake or assess an individual for their readiness for group. And some of it is safety, some of it is some of like that persona that this individual was putting on, right? Like I love those. I love like the ones that seem to be like the tough nut to crack. Because often those are the ones that you know are the mushiest marshmallows inside. So I love that. And the fact that, you know, that she kept getting to a place where it was clear that she was having an emotional breakthrough moment, but wasn't ready to go. It was so important that Nancy knew to back off and to let her do her healing at her own rate. Right. And it's a dance, because those of us who are therapists, not just advocates, know that there are therapeutic ways of challenging. And every once in a while, when you haven't had a breakthrough, you're encouraged to do that. You're encouraged to push a little bit to see if you can get somewhere else. And like that, like sometimes you do it and it bombs, you know, and it doesn't go well, and that's okay. And sometimes you do it and it leads to a whole thing, right? But when you're in an incarcerated setting, this is difficult because, like Nancy said, your time with this individual is limited. So if you are in a place where you're not going to have the time, you know, and we know this, like clients will drop bombs on us at the very ends of sessions.
Yeah.
And and in a session where you maybe don't have another person coming in next, you can explore that. You can give them some homework. You have a lot more like flexibility to figure out how you want to deal with the bombs that they drop on you last minute. But in this setting, you can't, right? Because you don't want to send them off hurting. You don't want to start something that you can't keep going, or that you can't end in a place where you have restabilized them. And so a lot of this work is intuitive. It is about kind of like knowing your client, knowing yourself, knowing the environment that you're in. And so, you know, when we're talking about like self-expression, what I love about the art, and I tried to talk a little bit about this, about the writing, right? Because you shared that letter writing experience, is that they're learning a technique that they could potentially use later too, to extend the practice, because we know that processing your trauma doesn't end when a session ends. It doesn't end when a support group session ends, right? You keep processing a lot of that after the fact. And so when we're talking about, like, you know, one's self-perception, one's doubts, you know, some of the work that we do, we have to let them know, hey, I want you to understand that when we engage in this work, it might also bring up triggers for you. You know, you might have dreams. You may get angry and not know why you're angry, and validate that for them. And the only way you're going to know that is if you're paying attention during the therapeutic process, and how they create art is going to tell you a little bit about them too, right? Like, what is the self-critical voice that comes out when they're doing this piece, right? That tells you something. You know, it's like who was the person in their life who was highly critical, that they've now internalized that voice so much that it is a part of their own. It's a part of their own internal dialogue, right? And how do we start to shift that inner voice? What could that inner voice look like, and how could it look differently, right? And so it does promote a different way of survivors looking at themselves, and starting to identify, oh wow, I am being really mean to myself. Why do I do that, right? And just starting to plant the seed for exploration of oneself, and then how that impacts the way that you are with others, right? Like, again, we're not just creating a healing for that individual, but we're creating healing for everyone that individual comes into contact with. Because one thing that we know that is pervasive, particularly in this population, is that hurting people hurt people, right? And there's a survivor who tells the story of she envisions trauma being, and I think it wasn't you, I think it was Delia who used to use the curriculum. It was like the Warrior Handbook, and then it was called like the Healing Handbook. Angela Shelton put together this handbook, and it's all about writing. But her visualization for that is that trauma is like having a sword through your heart, right? And so the impact of trauma is that you're constantly in pain. And so that's what you were seeing with this client, is that the client still had that sword through their heart, and they had not yet decided whether they even wanted to pull it out, right? And then what are the problems that present themselves after you open that wound, right? After you pull that sword out of your heart, now you have this gaping wound that is bleeding, maybe infected, right? Like I love that visual, because it's a good visual to work with, particularly with this population. And so a lot of survivors in incarcerated settings might be aware, or might become aware through the work with you, that they have that wound there, but might say, I can only look at the wound that's there right now. I can't pull that sword out yet. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. You're going to understand that that's because they're in a setting where they don't feel safe, and where they might not have the opportunity to make it safe for themselves until they're out.
Emma, I wanted to mention real quick with that client, actually, after that group session that we had, you can tell that in the individual, I actually went to see her the next day, because
Awesome.
you have to keep in mind, you know, when you're doing this type of work, as Ella mentioned, you know your clients. And I wanted to see how she was doing because this was a breakthrough for her. So I
Wow.
actually went to go and see her, and you can just tell like the toll that she got out. Like she was actually trying to now actually um, express herself with me, and that it was safe. And I think it was also more of the support of everyone there too. And it wasn't just me, you know, but it was the group that made her feel safe. So I did check on her the next day because, as Eva said, when you know, get that sore
Mhm.
out, you leave it
Yeah.
open. And I
Yeah.
wanted to, she did fine. It was a good thing. Everything went well, but you still want to check on your client to see how she's doing. And
I love
it,
that.
it went really well. And I forgot to mention, Eva, with this workshop, that especially at the beginning, is if you feel more comfortable, especially if you're starting this type of work for group counseling, have a co-facilitator with you. I forgot to mention that. I do
Yeah.
have experience, and even with my experience, sometimes when we do, you know, 2-session group project, I like to have my partner with me, my co-facilitator, because as you mentioned, Eva, there could
Mhm.
be a situation where I am doing, you know, the group and
Yeah.
someone, you know, having their moment. That does happen.
Yeah.
Definitely, you know, do plan that it could happen. So having a co-facilitator, I think it's amazing to have. You know, I didn't always have a co-facilitator with me,
Mhm.
but if you can, especially if, you know, you're new to this, it would be great to have a co-facilitator to help one
Yeah.
another. And just know with that co-facilitator, you kind of have to be in tune with them. When you feel stuck or they want to, you know, it has to be a little bit more natural. So just keep that in mind who you pick as a
Mhm.
co-facilitator too.
Yeah. That's a really wonderful reminder. And so while this, you know, we're making the assumption with this workshop that people are already engaged in some group work, some either support groups or group therapy. But if you're not, and if you're new to groups particularly, um, there's only so much one person can do. And so like Nancy's saying is you can have different roles and you can exchange roles, right? So if you're having somebody who you visually notice, like let's say Nancy's leading the group and my role is now to scour the room looking for reactions, looking for how people are, what their body language looks like, what they're doing, whether they're paying attention, whether they're tapping their foot, you know,
Mm-hmm.
rapidly. All that is giving us some insight into their well-being. What, you know, if there's some anxiety coming up, like I might be in tune to be like, take a moment, like when Nancy's like at a pause, be like, hey, so and so, I'm noticing that, you know, and I'm not saying anything that isn't already in the room,
Right.
right? Like if they're tapping their foot, everybody's noticing that. So I'm just naming the elephant in the room. I noticed that you're tapping your foot. Like, are you nervous? Like, what's going on? And they might like blow it off like nothing's wrong, or they might be like, oh well, you know, and like they might turn to a person and like they're like, well, I'm not going to say anything today because a certain somebody is in this group today. That
Mm-hmm.
lets you know that there's some internal conflict in that room that day that is going to possibly make it impossible to do healing work, and you might shift the way that you do your group that day. Because again, like one of the wonderful things about group settings is that it's an opportunity to see how people resolve conflict in a healthy way, and survivors who have trauma have learned really unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict, or or they're afraid of conflict because conflict has meant harm. And so if you can facilitate a place where the conflict gets resolved and every party gets heard, it might feel like, wow, I've never been able to resolve a conflict like this, like say what I was feeling. But it might be scary to do if you're the only person in the room, you know, and there isn't another person who can like call for help. And so we do want to recognize that in rural settings, often groups are being led by single advocates, you know. And so where possible, if you have, for example, a dual center where you have a domestic violence counterpart, perhaps you form a relationship with that domestic violence counterpart and you say like, hey, I know you don't do the SV portion, but maybe we can team up and facilitate our groups together. That way, when you do SV, you know, I'll come and I'll learn about SV, and there's some cross-pollination happening there. You might get more clients that way too, because often people might be more comfortable disclosing domestic violence before they ever disclose sexual violence. And so that becomes a way to also kind of tap into like survivorhood and a topic that is often less likely to come up around sexual violence, particularly because behaviors around sexual violence are often not identified as sexual violence, right? There's so much, for example, trafficking or sex work that happens in a lot of our communities that goes unnoticed because we don't have the language, right? Like you're like, well, I didn't exchange any money for sex. I'm like, but if I'm living with an individual who's harmful, just because I'm afraid of leaving that individual because I feel like I am not going to be financially stable, that's a form of sex work that you're engaging in. Whether, you know, we've normalized that as a society or not, it is. So there is some stuff there that we can also, like that psychoeducational piece, we can tap into. And so some of these forms of expression are things that we've kind of talked about throughout, but we really wanted to give you the idea that there are so many exercises out there that you can engage in that are helpful for different types of exploration. And so simple exercises with these survivors who are incarcerated include, you know, exploring dreams, creating like maybe a group project where you create a banner, or I love like gratitude trees where like everybody gets to add a hand. One of the ones that I really love is called Life News Story. It's one where on one side you take basically clippings from like newspapers or magazines and you create a part of your story the way that you perceive it. And then on the other side, so it's like two columns, just like a newspaper. And on the other side, you create and you get to report like the end of the story. But it's great because it's like a creative part of the story. So it's how you come to terms with the part of the perception on the left, right? Like, or creating a new future for yourself that is a very different future. And so that one, even though it's so simple, it's such a powerful way to express yourself. And so, you know, sort of like to kind of wrap it up, there are tons of resources that, you know, folks who've been doing this work have at their disposal or can provide. And so one of the things that we like to do with these rural opportunities to engage with other advocates, with other partners in our communities, is to remind you that the council, the Florida Council Against Sexual Violence, is a resource for you. Should you need like activity examples, should you need like recommendations for books that have great activities, and more importantly, your fellow advocates are great resources because they are engaged in this work. And so if you're a direct service advocate and need to be added to our FCASV advocate list, all you have to do is just get in contact with me and I will add you, and you can literally send an email to the listserv that will go out to all the advocates. And generally, you know, advocates are all about sharing resources and being a support to one another, because we know that this work can be lonely, it can be confusing, and honestly, we don't need to be recreating the wheel because we have enough work as it is out in our communities. And so my email is ediaz@fcasv.org. And you can reach out to me either for some of those examples or for access to the listserv. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to access the chat and I'm going to put my email in there. And Nancy, you probably would like to do the same thing.
Okay. Let me go ahead.
Yes. And so that is my my contact information in the chat, ediaz@fcasv.org. And this presentation, this PowerPoint presentation will be provided along with the summit materials. So this is the FCASV's biannual summit of 2020. And so it will go out, and we will also have it accessible for folks who might be viewing this after the summit. If you reach out to one of us, we can send it your way as well. So the last slide is really just about references for further information. If you liked some of the quotes that Nancy included, wanted to see some examples of things that you can tap into to kind of expand your work in this area, these are all wonderful resources that she's put together for you.
And thank you for this opportunity. I do appreciate it. Eva and I are happy to do this.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to joining you virtually at the FCASV Summit at the end of this month. So we're recording this September 10th. Of 2020, and we also look forward to meeting you and getting to know those of you who see it after then.